Okay, so today we're going to talk about reading William McNeill's Polyethnicity and National Unity in World History. Okay, so we talked last week. I mentioned the difference between race and ethnicity a little, or no? This is not something we got into. No, I told you guys about sociology and this idea of seeing ourselves in time, space, and structure. Okay, so does anybody know from how many people here have taken Intro to Soc? A few of you guys. Okay, does anybody from the Intro to Soc remember the difference between race and ethnicity? No? Okay, cool. So we review. Everyone's on the same page then. So race. So race is a subset of ethnicity. Yeah.
Isn't race like kind of how you identify, like with your culture and ethnicities, where you're from or something, or what you are?
So ethnicity is the group you belong to. So like ethnicities are these sort of constructed cultural groups. So ethnicity is like, you know, you think about different, and they overlap, right? So ethnicity is like the culture you belong to, the practices you have, whatever sort of like group affiliation you have, right? So it's cultural. So we're all from different cultures, right? And that is our ethnicity. Does this make sense? So if we think about it this way, ethnicity is a large bubble, and we'll say these are cultural groups. In fact, if you just want, every time you see the word ethnicity, to think cultural groups, like that's exactly the same thing, basically, right? So ethnicity are cultural groups. You can either identify yourself with it, or you can have it labeled onto you, right? There are ethnic groups that exist because other people identify them as X, Y, and Z, right? So it's either externally given to you, or it's something that you yourself identify with and belong to with other people. Okay, so race is a subset of ethnicity. So race is a subset of ethnicity. In particular, what race denotes is it denotes the tying of ethnicity to physical attributes. So if we identify something like different races of people on the basis of, if we delineate our different ethnicities on the basis of the color of people's skin, or the shape of their eyes, or the size of their cranium, or whatever, right? Like these things are race. This is an important distinction because both of these are socially constructed. Neither of them are real, like in ontological sense. And what I mean by that, what the word ontology means, is like actually physically real. They're both things that we constructed and created. So we created racial groups and we create ethnicities, right? But they don't quite work the same way. It's also important for another reason, which is race is a fairly novel thing. It's new. Ethnicity is not. Ethnicity, like as far as we can tell, ethnicity stretches back as far as humanity, right? So people have always formed different cultural groups and identified with them, right, as far as we can tell. But those differences have only been tied to race, mainly after the 1600s. So very new if we're talking world historically. Right, so people have not identified people on the basis of their physical attributes, what they look like, right, in the past. In the past, they more identify groups on the basis of things that are a little more ephemeral and cultural. It's also important because the boundaries between races are very different if you're talking about, or the boundary between groups are very different if you're talking about ethnicity, right? Because you can change from one culture to another. You cannot change your physical attributes. So it sticks people within certain categories and determines how they're treated in a far more immediate sense. Does all that make sense so far? So that's kind of, there's one more term I want us to get down, and that term is difference. So we also have to understand ethnicity is embedded with a whole variety of ways in which we differentiate between groups of people, right? We largely construct the differences experienced in our society, right? So there's whole sorts of, and usually when you're thinking about difference, usually difference in sociology implies some sort of inequality. It's just not sort of like blanket, like some people are different from others. As a general rule, at least in modern societies, you rarely get differences that are equal, right? So we treat genders differently, and it's hierarchical. We treat races differently, and it's hierarchical. We treat ethnicities differently, and it's hierarchical. Does it make sense? So we don't treat, a good example would be of an ethnicity that's not seen as a race. We don't treat Latinos and Latinas differently on the basis of race per se, because they're all, even on surveys like, in the United States, they're categorized as white. We treat them differently on the basis of their ethnicity. It works a little differently, but it's also similar, right? I'm going to suggest that societies have always functioned off of difference, even if they haven't functioned off of race. And that's one of the reasons why it seems strange for me to stand up here and be like, races are a new thing, right? Because we think about, well, there's always been inequality, right? But those inequalities are not done on the basis of physical attributes. So it changes. And this isn't to say one's better and one's worse. You could make arguments either way, right? But society has functioned off of forms of inequality built on difference. And understanding the difference between those is really useful, right? Make sense so far? So in a lot of ways, this story is a story, the story you're going to get in the class of race and ethnicity is the story of the birth of race and the birth of probably the predominant form of ethnicity that people believe in today, which is nationality, right? So we're going to see how these things come into being, and then we're going to see how they act on our world today. Make sense? So to get us into and out of thinking that race is historical, we're starting to this week with looking at some other systems, some other ways of making difference. And what is and isn't important. Okay. Any questions or confusions on that or comments people want to make? I believe in long pauses, by the way, just to make sure. So, and this is now my 11th year teaching, so I've gotten really comfortable with people being quiet in front of me. So, I will, if you can take time to formulate. There's no rush in thinking, so. Well, let's go ahead and dig into William McNeill's book. So William McNeill is an example of something referred to in sociology as world systems theory. World systems theory is particularly interested in the creation of sort of like the modern way of thinking about nationality. We'll get into some more of that sort of stuff later, but this book in particular is William McNeill's book about what happened beforehand, which is why I assigned it. Some of the later chapters are on, sorry, catching my breath, on nationality. Okay, so what does it mean to be polyethnic? What if we live in a polyethnic society, what does that mean? We do live in one, by the way. That's a baby. That's better. From the book, what did you gather? What does it mean to be polyethnic as a society?
I think it means like a society where there's like people from lots of different places.
Yeah, it's a society that's composed of, so whenever you see poly, it means multiple, right? So it's essentially a system of where there are different or multiple ethnicities. So I said we are a polyethnic society. How could we claim to be a polyethnic society? How do we see that?
The sheer amount of people from different places, different nations, and I guess more commonly in 21st century race.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a variety of racial and ethnic groups, often take, people coming from other places, sometimes people who have been here for, like our own society has some very long embedded forms of ethnicity that don't necessarily line up, right? What are some different ethnic groups in the United States? What are some different ethnic groups? This is a very obvious question. I should be able to answer it.
Like Catholics? Or
Yeah, you could think of Catholics as their own ethnic group, especially like sometimes the dominant ethnic group in the United States. I mean dominant not as in better, but dominant as in they enact the most power upon other groups of people, are sometimes referred to as WASPs, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So in some ways you could look at Catholics as a subset of the population, sometimes which have actually kind of struggled for legitimacy within the United States, right? What other ethnic groups do you have? And then even within Catholicism, you have a lot of different ethnic groups as well, sub-ethnic groups, right? Yeah.
I mean, when you take a standardized test or something and it asks your ethnicity, it says black, Latino, not Latino, Caucasian, other, stuff like that.
Yeah, it could be those things, right? And then even within that, there's a lot of subcategories, right? Especially if you think you're in a major metropolitan area, right? Asian covers a lot of different ethnic groups. There are people who are here from India. There are people who are here that are Hmong, right? Which doesn't even tie to a specific nation, right? Does anybody have Hmong populations where they come from? That's a very northern Midwestern thing. Anyways, yeah, we're a polyethnic society because to some degree we live within a system that has all these different ways of doing things embedded within it, right? Another way to put it is, even though we have a language about our nation being somewhat unified culturally, it's not really, right? A polyethnic society is a mixed society without any cultural unity, right? And we often talk a lot about how do we become more unified as a people, or questions like that. And essentially what William McNeill would say is, unity is actually really rare and grows out of a specific historical circumstance, right? And he wants to say that if we look before this sort of early modern period, right, starting in this, like the 15 and 1600s to like the 1800s, nobody has the idea that people within a given territory should be the same. It doesn't exist as a thought. So instead, people are polyethnic. So how does he show this? What sort of places is he talking about in this section I gave you? I even saw some questions about what some of this meant in the discussion board. So if you have questions about it too, that works. What are some of the groups that? As a general rule, I should have said this the first day. In my classes, it's really useful if you bring your computers or cell phones, and before we even get started, just bring up the document, because I like to talk a lot about the document, right? So it's worth doing. So if you, some of the people who've had me all, I can see that they've already done that. He talks about a variety of polyethnic. First of all, his starting point is he's giving this as basically this is a study that he's done, and he's giving it as a lecture there. Anybody catch this? This is at the very front of the section I gave you. It's essentially the same thing I just set up, but a different country.
He's talking about his experience in Canada, right?
Yeah, he's talking. So essentially, he's speaking in Canada, and he's talking about Canada as a polyethnic society. In particular, like, does anybody know what, like, the two major language groups in Canada are?
French and English.
French and English, right? So, like, in a lot of ways, Canada is a combination of French speakers, French Canadians, English-speaking Canadians, and Indigenous peoples, right? As well as other ethnic groups that have migrated there through the years, right? And so, like, in thinking about, like, this conversation about, like, what does it mean to be a country where everything has to be in two languages is kind of the start. Has anybody ever been to Canada? Yeah? What part of Canada did you go to?
I went to Quebec and the Niagara Falls.
Okay, cool. I mean, growing up, Canada was just where we went drinking as a teenager, because it's legal there. I think the age was 17 when I was a teenager, so, like, you know, you're in high school, and I was only like an hour and a half away from Canada, so it's like, let's cross the Windsor Bridge and, like, go to Canada, and, you know, go camping afterwards or whatever, right? Like, everything in Canada is often in two languages, right? This is very different than the United States. Like road signs in Canada are in two languages, right? Everything, all the signs that you see are in both French and English for the most part, depending on what part of Canada you're in. So thinking about like language being something that we often view as something very unified, right? And you can think about like the politics surrounding the use of English in the United States, right? You have minority groups that don't speak English vying for legitimacy, while at the same time a lot of people are very angry about the fact that anybody would come here and not speak English, right? That's a politics that surrounds like this hierarchy, this ethnic hierarchy that we live in, this racialized ethnic hierarchy. Right, so he's starting at this point of being like Canada often gets harassed as not having much unity because there is clearly a French-speaking section of Canada, Quebec, right, and clearly an English-speaking section of Canada, pretty much the frozen everything else around it, right? So that's kind of the starting point, right? And what he says is, getting back to just like I said about our own society, he's saying this isn't really that abnormal. It's treated as abnormal because we went through this period where we can think about the world was a lot more ethnically diverse at one point than it is today. We don't normally talk that way, right? We talk about it as if the world was somehow less diverse and we live in a more diverse society. We hear this kind of language a lot. But if you just take the sheer number of languages which used to be spoken at one time, right? There was something like 100 different languages spoken in France at one point. The language of French didn't come about by accident. it was by making it illegal to speak all the other languages, so that Parisian French became the only language that was legal to use. Quite literally, often the threat of imprisonment, right? So like our world often used to be very ethnically diverse, right? And if you think about, like, has anybody here ever taken cultural anthropology? I think it used to be sociology of culture here at one point when you guys were still here. Has anybody ever taken this class? That class is sort of like the class where you look at like all the other ways of doing things that are other than modern Western ways of doing things, right? So essentially you look at all the other forms of societies, right? And like there's a term, anthropologists talk about small scale societies, smaller societies that are sometimes built of like, you may have 50 people living in your society and sometimes, right? You may have 200 people, depending on what sort of society you live in, right? At one time, there were a lot more people like that, sort of indigenous peoples that had a variety of languages and a variety of practices, right? So our world was very ethnically diverse, right? So getting back to like the idea that we would have one ethnicity would be really strange in that world, right? Where maybe you could speak the same language as people who lived within a 50-mile radius of you. You know, and we can think about like how much more linguistically diverse America was before Western countries took it over, right? So Native Americans were a lot more diverse than the population that settled here, right? So there's a lot less diversity on the American continent than there would have been at one time. Okay. Granted for a little while. Anybody want to venture what place? He's talking about historically, what place and time do we see William McNeill taking as his example? Scroll through the text if you actually have it on. You can just holler out names. You guys are quiet this morning. Is it just because it's an 8 o'clock class and I'm asking you to think about things? Okay. I'm just going to sit until somebody gives me an answer. Quite a few right answers.
Can you ask the question one more time, please?
So what part of the world is he talking about? What time period, what part of the world is William McNeill looking at in this text that I gave you?
Before civilized society.
Yeah, what does he, well, yeah, so what does he mean by that? Like, what does he mean particularly? There's a lot of definitions of civilized. Does anybody catch what he means?
I thought he kind of meant like civilized as in living in larger groups instead of a nomadic lifestyle.
Yeah, so he's picking up on, if we were to go into and teleport back into the past, right? Even when, like, and he's looking at like ancient societies. So in particular, he's looking at places like kind of like Rome or like, you know, like what was in the Middle East at one point, right? China, places like that, right? He's drawing on this tension, right, between nomadic populations and civilized populations. And his point is this, that regardless of which of these you look at, so even when we first start living in large groups together, right, regardless of which ones we look at, right, you're still going to find a form of polyethnicity happening here. So, to some degree, we have to unthink the way in which our countries work, the way in which our states work. So, you think about, like, we live in a country, how much has the borders of the United States changed in your lifetime? It hasn't. How much has the borders of the United States changed in your parents' lifetime? hasn't, right? Grandparents, it hasn't really, right? Like, when was the last time the United States added a new state? Right? Point being is that we live in a world with very set boundaries, right? There's a specific history to this, right? And we'll talk about this more when we get into the development of nationalism, right? But before that, right, that's not how societies worked. So often what you had, when we actually had like larger, what anthropologists would call state systems. So this is where you have a government, because a lot, like, throughout most of human history, people existed without a government, without any real structured economy, without any of those things, right? Because they were so small they didn't need them, right? So these are things like bands. Bands are groups of people that have a tendency to hunt or gather, right? And they usually exist in groups of under 200, right? And you get groups like, this is the, you know, back to like, that's sort of like the anthropology of it. What anthropologists would call state systems, right, are these things that instead of having rigid boundaries, what we would call the nation state, right, in sociology. So like those are nations, we live in a nation state. Before that, pre-modern states have a tendency to be what's sometimes referred to as empires, right? As in they're built upon this sort of extraction. So, and I know that you guys are not ancient historians, you're all sociologists or criminologists, right? But does anybody know how big Rome is? There's two answers, and they're very different answers you can give.
Very big.
One answer would be very big. It incorporated all of the Mediterranean for the most part, right? What would be the opposite answer? There's another possible right answer. It's very small. It's only the city of Rome. Right? So what you have in sort of like this period is a lot of times things will start out as just a city, right? And in the old system, to some degree, like a city would just die if it just stayed the same size. So instead what it does is it just sort of constantly expands, right? And takes over more and more territory. Well, thinking about how we just talked about how diverse the world is, what happens as they expand, do you think? What do you end up encompassing within your government as you expand?
Multiple groups, ethnicities.
Yeah, you end up taking over large chunks of territory of people who are extremely ethnically diverse. So you're talking about creating a society that's not, right, very mono-ethnic. It's not very like that there's one ethnicity. You have instead these essentially like all of these people that you've now gathered into your system. So something very different. What do you think? Did anybody catch from the reading what they did with these populations a lot? We can actually think of some like examples of something that you might have interacted with, if you guys don't catch those. Okay, let's go that route. So, how well do you guys know your like Old Testament Bible history? Does anybody know the story of Daniel? I see some nods. Does anybody know what happens to Daniel? What happens to Israel towards the end of the Old Testament? It gets taken over, right, by another empire, the Babylonians and then the Assyrians, right? So what happens is in the example of Daniel, we all know the story of Daniel in terms of like he got thrown to the lions and some of us know the fiery furnace. Where is he when those things happen? Do people know where he's at? He's in Babylon, right? So like here we get an example of essentially like as Babylon grows out, it takes over other places and ends up taking over just like Rome does, right? Just like ancient Greece does other cities, right? And what do they do in those cities? Well, they don't kill off the entire population. They don't, right? They take essentially people who can do things that are useful, and then they move them into their own city, right? So here you have, somebody the Babylonians taking over certain groups of Israelites and then training them to be in the government, right? This actually happens in most early societies. It happens in the Middle Ages. This is often how Jewish populations work in the Middle Ages. Like Jewish people work for the government. They're actually really high up in the society despite the fact that they're actually marginalized because of religious differences, right? So like you have them literally sort of being taken from one place, brought out to the other, right? So that's kind of an example, right? The example of Daniel, that's essentially one of the processes he's talking about. So that's the process, if you're talking about this sort of system, is that they take things over and like, if they take over a city and that city has great architecture, then they take all the masons and say, okay, you're now going to live wherever, right, this is going to be. Now what's weird is like their status, even though it's not a part, their societies are so diverse that they actually often are allowed to be fairly high in the hierarchy. And so this is very different than our own system and how we understand it. Okay, I'll give you another example. I like using the Old Testament because it's like stories that at least a lot of us are vaguely familiar with, right? Okay, so does anybody know the story of Joseph in Egypt? What happens to Joseph? Does anybody know? This is the guy with the many colored coats. Does anybody know this story?
He gets taken from his home and put into slavery in Egypt.
Yeah, his brothers are jealous because his dad likes him more than other people, so they're going to murder him, but then they see essentially traders going by and, well, we'll just sell him into slavery. Make a little money. So they sell him into slavery and he gets taken to Egypt. What happens to him in Egypt?
Doesn't he become like part of the government, like more kind of powerful?
Yeah. So he starts out a slave and then he ends up basically like in this like basically he ends up in sort of like inner court of Egypt, which is actually really common. Like in Egyptian history, there's people who were bought in slavery and then wind up pharaohs, right? Like so like you have what is a very different world than how we structure difference is the point here, right? Difference is very fluid, it's very changing, right? So that's one of the major points, right, that he's making here. Any questions so far? No. Do you guys see how this is very different than the system we live in? Let's back up a little bit. How does what we just described different, if we were to just take something like slavery, how is it different from the forms of slavery that the United States practiced?
Could you say it again?
How is the form of slavery we just sort of described in that example different from the form of slavery that the United States practiced?
Well, in the United States, like, they weren't given, like, higher positions.
Yeah. How like, I guess, like, how rigid is that comparatively? Whenever we think about ancient slavery, or whenever we think about ancient difference, one thing to realize is it's just not, difference making just isn't as rigid, right? This is true clean into like parts of early modernity, so like groups that later on would be racial. So like in the 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century, was it legal for people of different racial groups in the United States to marry? No, right? Has anybody ever read in like a literature class or when they're in high school read Othello? Othello is one of Shakespeare's tragedies, right? Othello's black in Shakespeare's tragedy, right? This is almost never brought up in the play, he's married to somebody who's white, and he works as essentially like a general for a major family in Italy, right? See, once again, you think about differences in structure, right? Race is not particularly important in their world, right? Religion is, but race is not. I did a study recently on, it had to do with race in South African rap videos. And while doing reading for this, I read this sort of thing about Cape Town, this sort of like history of Cape Town in South Africa. And when initially like the Dutch colony came to South Africa in the 1600s, like anybody could become Dutch if they learned how to speak Dutch and converted to Calvinism, Protestant Calvinism, right? So like here in this very diverse society, because it's sort of like the stopping off point. So you had people from the colonies that the Dutch had out in like Southeast Asia. You know, you had Chinese people that they essentially like kidnapped because they were politically unuseful for them. You had people from the Middle East living there. You had people from other parts of Africa, slaves from Madagascar, etc., living in Cape Town. Any of those populations, and you know, they often see this, will become Dutch and then marry Dutch people, right? So you think about the fluidity of that, right? It's a very different form of society. It's a polyethnic society. We don't truly, in some ways we live in a polyethnic society, in some ways we don't, right? And that's what William McNeill is trying to capture, is that what came before modernity felt very different, right? There are still forms of difference. So what are the forms of difference? We've kind of nodded at them. What forms of difference do you think are important in those societies? So let's not glorify them. What's one major difference that people have in the pre-modern world? Religion is probably the biggest, right? Particularly if you're talking about within Europe, like religious differences is the predominant form of difference. So most people are going to understand the world through a lens of, right, religious difference. If you read something like journals of people who travel from like the Middle Ages. I recently also did a project that involved that. But anyway, so like if you read something like Marco Polo's travels, he goes all over the place and he never comments on the race of people. Sometimes he'll describe what they look like physically if he thinks they're particularly attractive or something, right? But then otherwise he's basically like, what was their religion? Could they be converted to Christianity? Right? That's basically every place he goes, he's like, no, these people are too Muslim. They're never going to be Christians. You know, you shouldn't, right? Like, and he has a whole thing about Hindus, that he thinks Hindus are really close, right? So he talks really positively about Hindus, but then also accuses them of being devil worshippers, right? So like here you get the form of differences. He travels across space, right? Has to do specifically with religion, right? Religion becomes a major sticking point. And often, like, you know, in our society, we have a lot of violence surrounding race and ethnicity, right? In other societies, you get a lot of violence surrounding religion in particular, right? More so. You can still say this is a major difference in non-Western countries sometimes. So in Muslim countries, often, they think about the world less through racialized structures like we think of it, and more through, right? They're influenced by the West, so they do think about things in racialized structures. Once we open that Pandora's box, the whole world kind of ends up being a part of it, right? But on the other hand, like, they think of the world more through religious difference, right? Or before modernity in the United States, you get often things like really sort of like pronounced forms of violence surrounding this religious difference. So a good example of this is, I was recently reading a book that was talking about this practice of like during Holy Week in parts of Europe, they had on Good Friday the killing of the Jews. And they'd go out through the streets, and any of the people who were Jewish who didn't hire enough of an entourage to protect them, they would murder. And that was a part of the regular, and even into the 20th century in parts of Catalonia, they practiced this symbolic thing where they created basically like a papier-mâché person and the children beat the Jew to death. Right? So here you get like the point is like difference is often hostile, right? But which ones are and how people feel about it is very transitionary, right? Make sense? Okay, cool. Okay, I want to give a nod to something, attention that appears both in this and that we're going to talk about more in Hair Talk. I'm going to check on something real quick. Awesome, we're still recording. Yesterday, all of my recordings cut off after a minute and a half. And I realized, this is just really annoying. So I bought this last spring when we went into like shelter at home and we all had to go home. And I used it to record, some of you guys were actually in those classes, right? I used it to record sort of like mini 15-minute lectures. Anyways, I was deleting those videos, right? But I didn't realize I actually saved the video in 3 places on the camcorder. So I was only deleting 2 of them. And there was a 3rd smaller file. And so I literally had every single video that I recorded from all the way back then to today, just sort of sitting in there. And it kept on shutting off. I'm like, what's going on? Like, the memory card's open, the battery's full. Like, I can't get this thing to work. And it turns out that, yeah. So, anyways. Foibles of switching to different systems. Okay, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, this is a tension we're going to see even more so popping up in our next reading, which is this difference between, and we've already kind of nodded at it, civilized and nomad. So civilized sometimes, and I think it's particularly in Hair Talk, you're going to see this, is also sometimes, like nomad is sometimes barbarian. It's actually where we get the word for is it's populations that were nomadic were referred to by Greeks as barbarians. So, okay, so yeah, basically like William McNeill gives us sort of this snapshot of the sort of Mediterranean world, right? And what we're going to get with Hair Talk is the forms of difference that particularly like you hear from ancient Greeks, right? But both of them actually have the same difference embedded inside their system of the difference between being civilized and nomadic. So, do people know what it means to be nomadic? Yeah. So generally speaking, you move around a lot as nomads, right? That's what it means. So it's that you don't have a permanent home, right? You often move between the same locations, right? But you're moving, right? You're constantly moving. There's something similar to that, which is called transhumanism as well. Transhumanism is when people move between 2 locations. They go one place during one season. Usually it's winter and summer in cold places, or it's dry and wet in warm places. But you get that sort of movement, right? Most people throughout history have been nomadic. So most people throughout history have essentially lived as nomads. Why do you think that is, if you were just to guess? There's a couple different reasons.
And you consider following food around based on like the crops that grow during certain seasons, or even just animals in general?
Yeah. Generally speaking, like you move. So particularly like most people throughout history have practiced hunting and gathering as a form of getting food. So essentially what you do is you hunt and you gather food, and then when resources start to get a little slim, you just move on, right? And you have like, maybe you know several places that are really good to get food, and you just move between them. You move once every couple of months or once every month, and you just do that, right, as a society. It may also be that you follow a specific animal, right? We often refer to that as pastoralism. So the first one is foraging, the second one would be pastoralism. pastoralism is basically like people get on there, people essentially follow reindeer or buffalo or whatever animal they have, horses, sometimes they ride horses, right? And so those are also nomadic peoples, right? There's a particular prejudice against nomadic peoples that exist in the pre-modern world. And so we often wouldn't think this way, but clinging into, when we start getting into modernity, there are actually large groups of people, particularly like if in the European context in Central Asia, that are entirely nomadic, right? They don't live settled existences. And there's still a lot of people to this day that live this way in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, even parts of North America, South America, right, that move in this sort of generalized way. How does your society differ if you're constantly on the move, do you think? What's different about your society?
You're less materialistic.
Yeah, you're gonna be less material. You can't, if you gotta carry everything from, anybody here ever backpack? Some people. How much do you like to carry when you backpack? You're obsessed with getting your pack as small as you can, right? Like, the same thing, like if you're constantly on the move, like you don't carry a lot of stuff around. Your material culture is very thin. What sort of things do you think that changes? If you don't have a lot of stuff. What sort of things might you not do? What sort of skills might you not have?
There might not be any need for like money per se, it's more like trading with each other and like less just like shopping, I guess would be the best way to put it. That like we have in our society or other bigger societies.
Yeah, if you were to conduct any sort of like market sort of stuff, it would probably be through barter, right? You'd probably try to do as little as you could. You're likely not to have a developed system of reading, right? Your language is likely not to have a written form to it. It's likely to be just spoken, oral, which also means that your histories are oral, your religion is oral, an oral tradition, right? All those sort of things. So generally speaking, within the ancient medieval worlds, you get a lot of hostility towards these nomadic peoples as being inferior, right? Because they move around. And they don't have a big developed material culture. They don't develop arts as well. They don't have a written language. Now, in reality, they're just as smart, just as right as everybody else, right? But if you were to pick out another form of difference other than religion that's really important, this distinction between nomadic and settled is another really important distinction. So not all nomad groups are the same, right? In the text for today, you get some nomadic groups that actually manage to, like, in some ways dominate certain parts of politics, one of which is the Assyrians, right? So how does a nomadic, I guess, like, rather than having the settled state, if you have a nomadic state, how do you think that plays into this? So if you're a state that literally just sort of like, this is actually a form of subsistence people sometimes practice. It's sometimes referred to as raiding, right? Like where literally like your system is basically you take resources from other people, right? Which is also a nomadic system, right? You could think about, if you think about stereotypes of a group of people like the Vikings, right? The Vikings are nomads, right? They're nomadic peoples that take over regions of, travel, take over regions, take resources, right? Most people don't know this. Native Americans were actually a big state system at one time. Some of the biggest, during what would be our Middle Ages, some of the biggest empires in the world were actually in North America. There's very little remnant of them left because there was no written tradition within their society, so we don't really know a lot about them, right? But like, what you do see is when that system collapsed, you get groups of people that take on that sort of raiding system, right? So there are certain Native American tribes that's how they practice their subsistence, right? A good example of that would be like the Comanches out of the Apache tribe, right? Essentially, they didn't practice other intensive forms of subsistence. They raided other places, right? And so thinking in the ancient world, you'll sometimes these systems themselves will get very large and very diverse, right? And why do you think that might be? Why would a large, if you're talking about, a group of people, this is where our word horde originally comes from, which is very disparaging now, but like large groups of people that were nomadic, that were raiders, that could get up into the thousands, were called hordes back in the ancient world, basically. This was at least the origin of our word. So if you're thinking about like, why would that become an ethnically diverse society?
I mean, if one group of people raids another, they're more than likely going to take some of those people as slaves, or even entrap some of them like as wives or something like that. And just at that point, if that group is already racially diverse, then that's just adding even more people to the group that they were raided by.
Yeah, essentially, like, there's a breakdown of boundaries that happens through that movement, right? And through taking over, and yeah, they might enslave people, and as we know from our earlier examples, slavery is very fluid in the ancient world. So, like, you may be a slave one day, you might just be another member of their society in a few months, right? Like, it just depends on how things play out, right? So likewise, to this system, right, in reality, both of these systems are extremely diverse, right? Which is very different from the stereotypes of them to some degree too. So even though this is a major form of difference, you'll see Greeks talking about, like, essentially talking about nomadic tribes as if they're just these, like, individual singular groups of people, but that's actually not what they look like either, right? There's a lot of weird borrowing that happens amongst them and a lot of exchange, both for the societies that are very hierarchical and also for the ones that are very egalitarian, right? Because essentially groups, if you're talking about more egalitarian groups, the smaller groups, foragers, people who just are making a living, right? Essentially those groups of people, sometimes they're going to form together with other groups of people when it's convenient, sometimes they're going to split apart, right? Those boundaries are just constantly changing, so there is no clear, and like we talk about languages today as if there was like a language, like as if like you could go get a textbook and learn a language, right? And there was a, but languages themselves actually have very fluid boundaries, right? So like languages transition into one another, and it would be very unclear who is speaking what. Has anybody ever gone to a country where they speak a lot of languages? Has anybody ever traveled to a country where they speak a lot of languages? When I was when I studied in Senegal, most Senegalese people can speak 5 to 7 languages, just like everybody. Like sometimes you'll get people who come up, like, you might come across somebody who's like a beggar, who will walk up to you, start speaking French because they think you're French, realize you're not French, and then they might start speaking another language, right? They might start speaking Arabic, they might start speaking English, they might start speaking Spanish, all of which are spoken there, right? So that like, but like, when you actually engage in conversation, so I knew a little French. I was bad at speaking French. I knew like how to order food and stuff like that. But like the people that I regularly knew on a day-to-day basis, you would walk up to them, and this was just normal greeting. You'd walk up to them and you'd start in Arabic. Assalamu alaikum, alaikum salam, right? Like basically like, it's basically like, the sharing of peace, right? And then they'd immediately switch from that into Wolof, which is the African language that's predominant in Dakar. And they start speaking in Wolof. At some point, they'll start switching into French. And it's usually not all at once. Sometimes it's like a mixture of French and Wolof words. So you think about the language, like how we experience language in the United States is very like, right? Even today in a place that's that, if you will, polyethnic, right? That diverse, at least, that cosmopolitan, right? You're going to get a lot of fluidity in the linguistic world. You're going to get a lot of fluidity in the ethnic world, right? A lot more so than in a place like, here in Atchison, Kansas, where there's a lot less diversity. Okay, any questions or thoughts on this? Okay, great. So that's kind of the ground I wanted to cover with you guys. My goal for next class is for me to talk a lot less. So if you felt like you couldn't, if you feel like you're in a spot where you can't really talk about hair tog, you may want to dig back in. One thing I'm going to say, because the section, just to set it up, the section that I gave you on hair tog is not, it's not about what people are actually like, it's about what people say about them, right? So that doesn't come through in the section very strongly. Francois Hertog is an important figure connected to something we're going to look at later on called post-structuralism. We're going to look at post-colonialism, which is also a part of it. It's a theoretical tradition that talks about difference. Hertog's about that, but he studies ancient societies, which is why I give him as this precursor. And he talks, essentially his whole goal is to find out what are the rhetorics, and this is his term, the rhetorics of otherness, right, that's used in that society, right? So how is it that we see these sort of rhetorics of making difference, right? So he does this mostly through a close reading of one author, who's an ancient historian, Herodotus, right? So essentially, Herodotus essentially is like this weird combination of history and his own biographical travels and things he heard in his rumors. But essentially, he sort of combines these into this one narrative, which is mostly just looking at different people who are not Greek. So I gave you a section specifically on Scavians, which is what most of his book is on. This is an ethnic group that, by the way, does not actually exist in reality. So it is a somewhat invented ethnic group on the basis of people who are kind of real. So when you're reading back through that, right, do that, but make sure that for the next class you have a good enough understanding that I can kind of hand over the reins, because like it's boring to sit here and listen to me talk. It'd be a lot for both me and you, right? It's going to be a lot better if we can get a little more back and forth than we can do that. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So I'll send you off. I also know that you're doing the work of what should be actually a larger class as well. And I also know this is a weird time, yes, but I would like a lot more interaction.